Where do Trump's tariffs stand legally? Are foreign students bad for American universities? And are we really going to have to prove that rent control doesn't work again in New York City? I'm Dominic Dino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from a rent-controlled apartment where the rent hasn't changed in 25 years, and neither have the amenities. Just had to kill a cockroach. Sorry about that. But before we get to rent control, I want to spend the first segment talking about tariffs. I'm recording this late at night after the court decision from the United States Court of International Trade that struck down Donald Trump's most sweeping tariffs, the ones that he opposed under the emergency authority he claimed on April 2nd, the so-called Liberation Day. And this order has since been stayed by the Court of Appeals while that appeal is being heard. But what the court did is it struck down Trump's tariffs. It did not do so on a temporary basis. It did not do so only for some companies, the companies that challenged it. It did so across the board because it said that the way in which Trump did this was not constitutional. And so there has been a lot of talk about this decision, and I kind of just want to go through it and help you understand, because if you can get past the legal writing conventions of having your citations just randomly in the middle of a paragraph, it's pretty easy to read. It's very straightforward. It's very well explained by the judges that wrote it. And so when Trump goes out and says that this was some terribly biased decision by people who hate Donald Trump, that's really not what happened here. And I think the case shows us some really important things about the nature of tariffs as well. So, the basic finding of the case was very, very simple. It says that the Constitution assigns Congress the exclusive powers to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's clearly what tariffs do. They're tax on imports. Another word for that is a duty that gets used in law. That's the word that the Constitution uses. And just to make it extra clear, the Constitution also says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and tariffs are one way of doing that. So then it says that the question in the two cases before the court is whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, we're going to call that AIEPA, because I'm not going to say that whole name every time, delegates these powers to the president in the form of authority to impose unlimited tariffs. That word is really important, unlimited tariffs on goods from nearly every country in the world. The court does not read AIEPA to confer such unbounded authority, unbounded again being a really important word, and it sets aside the challenged tariffs imposed thereunder. So that's what the court said. That's the finding. It's three sentences. It's very simple. So they look back at sort of the history of trade in the United States, of tariffs, and they see that this power that Congress has over time been delegated in various ways to the executive branch. And the reason Congress did this was to try to get around some special interest problems that Congress was having, namely that people always want tariffs to benefit stuff in their district, but that comes at the expense of the country as a whole. So moving that to the president, who doesn't have a district, would help to minimize those special interest problems. It also just became the case that international trade became a very specialized field. And so members of Congress couldn't specialize in it and couldn't get the expertise they needed to make policy as effectively as they wanted to. And so they delegated certain things to the executive branch. Now, they did so in many cases under the understanding that the executive branch was going to seek freer trade, lowering trade barriers, because that's what's good for the country as a whole, even if certain cities or regions might be worse off in the short term. Then Congress also passed laws about national emergencies. One law says the process for declaring a national emergency. Another one, AIER, is the law that the president used after having declared a national emergency to impose tariffs. Now, it's important to know that AIER has never before been used to impose tariffs of any kind. In fact, the law hasn't been used that much at all. When it has been used, it's been for very short-term, temporary things about very specific trade problems. And so Trump's use of the law for all countries with no end date was completely out of step with how this law has been used in the past. So when people say, and you'll hear people say, Trump has said, well, other presidents got to impose tariffs by executive order, why don't I? The answer is they used different laws to do so. Those laws had different processes and procedures that they followed to allow them to do that. The courts have actually been extremely deferential to the executive branch on those questions in the past, as long as they're following the law that Congress wrote. Now, someone like me, who holds to a more conservative understanding of the Constitution and has real problems with Congress delegating all of that power to the executive, because these are fundamentally legislative powers, and the Constitution vests the legislative power in Congress. And so what I would like to see is a stronger application of the non-delegation doctrine, which says that Congress actually can't do that as much as it has. But all of that aside, the courts have said if you follow the laws that Congress has written, we'll allow you to do that. And so that's what Trump did during his first term, for example, when he used Section 232 and Section 301, two different parts of trade law, to impose tariffs on specific goods like steel and aluminum and on specific countries such as China. Those were all upheld. Those were all allowed by the courts. So this isn't an animus against Trump. This is an animus against abusing the law. And that's what the opinion from the Court of International Trade gets into. Now, it's important to know what this court is, because they don't get talked about very much. And it sounds like it's something unusual. But the Court of International Trade, first of all, it's a United States court. It's not an international body. It's based in the United States. It was created by Congress. It is a full Article 3 of the Constitution court. So this isn't some, international body ruling against America. That's not what happened here. This is an American court with American judges. And they're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, just like federal judges in any other court. They have specific jurisdictions over issues concerning international trade. And a part of the reason for this is what I was saying earlier, that international trade has become a specialized area of the law. And so Congress thought it might be helpful to have a specialized court to deal with those things. So they created one. And that's what it is. There were 3 judges on that court who ruled in this case. The 3 of them were unanimous in their judgment. They only had one opinion, and it wasn't signed by any one of them, so we don't know which one of them specifically wrote it. That's not an unusual thing in these circumstances. It's called a per curiam opinion. That happens a lot in federal courts. The 3 judges, one of them was appointed by Barack Obama. But the other two were appointed by Republicans. And in fact, one of them was appointed by Donald Trump himself. The other one was by Ronald Reagan. The one appointed by Ronald Reagan was actually the chief judge of this court for 7 years and is now in senior status. So these are really experienced people who have looked at these issues for a very long time. And if you read their opinion, that's exactly how it comes across. Again, I encourage you to check it out. It's not that long if you're interested in looking at it. It's very calm. There's no flowery language. There's no ideological claims in it about whether they agree with Donald Trump or whether they think he's a threat to democracy or anything. There's nothing like that at all. It's very matter of fact. It's very to the point. And it really seems to be like a pretty well-reasoned decision. It's not based on animus at all. So like I said, you've got 2 Republican appointees and 1 Democrat appointee. The one Republican who was appointed by Trump was actually recommended by Robert Lighthizer, who was Donald Trump's protectionist trade representative during his first term in office. So the idea that these are like hostile, anti-Trump free traders on this court is crazy. That's not who these people are. Now, they're looking at 2 different kinds of tariffs that Trump has imposed. One is about drug trafficking. These are the ones against Canada and Mexico that are higher rates. And then there are the worldwide retaliatory tariffs, which are the ones that were announced on April 2nd. So that's the 10% minimum for every country and then higher rates for countries with which the U.S. has a trade deficit. The plaintiffs in this case are a small business, a wine importer in the United States. And they just basically said, hey, we think these tariffs are illegal. We're being forced to pay them. That's an injury for us legally, so we're suing. Now, this might seem kind of mundane, and it really should be because it's obvious, but given that Trump and many protectionists often say that foreigners pay tariffs and American businesses have nothing to worry about, it's notable that there's an American business who had standing to sue because they were being hurt by the tariffs. Again, if it was really true that only foreigners are paying this and that American businesses won't be hurt, then they would have no reason to take the government to court about it. Yet they did, and the court recognized that they had standing to sue. So the court agreed that they were being hurt. So they broke up the question into a couple of different parts. One part is they said, does AIPA actually allow worldwide and retaliatory tariffs? The word tariff does not actually appear in that statute. It says you can regulate the importation of goods, and tariffs are one way to do that, so you can see how the case should be made. But remember, this is an emergency law. Trump declared a national emergency based on something that has been around for about 50 years, which is the existence of a trade deficit. The United States has run trade deficits since about the mid-1970s. It will continue to run trade deficits so long as we have a relatively low savings rate and relatively high consumption, which we do, and which really doesn't have very much to do with trade policy at all. So that basically means that these tariffs, supposedly on an emergency basis, would be able to last indefinitely based on something that has been going on for 50 years but just became an emergency a couple months ago. That doesn't really sound like an emergency power to me. And it doesn't sound like one to the court either. So the court makes a couple of really important distinctions when it's looking at this question. It says that an unlimited delegation of tariff authority would be unconstitutional. So what courts have said, a sort of lighter form of the non-delegation doctrine, they've said in the past, based on precedent, and all of this is based on precedent from other cases, some of which involve tariffs and some of which don't. Courts have said, yes, Congress, you can delegate some of your power to the executive, but it has to be for a clear purpose, and it has to come with limits. Because ultimately, the legislative authority does belong to Congress. And they cite the Federalist Papers about separation of powers. There's another legal doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine. This has been around in the law for many decades, but it really came to the fore in the West Virginia versus EPA case that the Supreme Court heard a couple of years ago. And the gist of the Major Questions Doctrine is that Congress, because, like we said before, because Congress, when it delegates authority, has to do so in a very limited and specific way. The president can't take that and then do something massive based on a very technical or literal reading of some of the words. So when AIER, for example, says that the president can regulate importation, that's very vague. Trump is regulating importation. He absolutely is doing that with the tariffs. But to do so in such a way that would be one of the largest tax increases in peacetime in American history, which is what the tariffs are, to do so against every country in the world at the same time, to do so at rates that the United States has not levied on foreign goods at least since the 1930s, in some cases, never as high as some of these rates are for some countries. That's a really big deal. Congress, when it was putting together a law in the 1970s about international economic emergencies, was probably not meaning to allow something like that to happen without their say-so. They were probably talking about the stuff that AIER has, in fact, in the past been used for, like sanctioning really specific things related to national security in times of emergency. And so a major question like that can't be hiding in a statute. Again, this is a really important conservative legal principle that the conservative justices on the Supreme Court have made a big deal of in the last couple of years. 3 of whom were appointed by Donald Trump to the Supreme Court. So it's the unlimited nature of these tariffs that really caused the legal problem for Trump. The court was perfectly willing to accept tariffs imposed on specific goods under Section 232 or Section 301, which have been approved by courts in the past. Trump is doing more of them as we speak. They will probably be allowed just the same. What he did here was different. And it was different in such a way that the law doesn't allow. Now, it just should bother anybody. I don't care what you think about trade or what you think about tariffs. It should bother anybody that a president has this much power. Because the Constitution just clearly doesn't allow that. Unilaterally making tax policy is one of the things that the Founding Fathers were most vigilant about. There are more Federalist Papers about taxation than there are about any other single topic. And they were very concerned about making sure that taxation decisions were made by the representative bodies, namely Congress, and that separation of powers would be respected. But unfortunately, Congress is not interested in doing its job. Congress should have acted on this on its own and constrained the president's power right away. They tried to do that. A handful of senators introduced some resolutions disapproving of the National Emergency Declaration, which would have made the whole thing go away. The problem is they need the president to sign that, so they need to have a veto-proof majority, so not just a 50% majority, but they need a 2/3 majority in both houses, which is hard to do. But they didn't even get close to that. And so, unfortunately, Congress didn't do anything to stop this. Now, you might also think that like big businesses would want to stop this because they're the ones that are going to be paying huge tariff bills. Companies like Walmart or Amazon. And they have to pass those costs onto their customers who are very price sensitive. But big businesses have decided that actually it's better off for them to try to cozy up to the government than to challenge it. We see this in a lot of the talk from CEOs when they go visit the White House and things like that. So the task of challenging this law fell to libertarian public interest law firms who go out and find small business clients to represent and bring these cases in federal court. Now, these are really small groups. Some of these places only have a dozen or so lawyers. But they're the ones who actually challenged this stuff and actually brought this case. And thank goodness for them. They're basically the only ones making separation of powers work at this point. Now, there were some state governments, too, that challenged this law. But this is similar to what we saw when Biden was president. You had Republican attorneys general at the state level challenging laws. This was Democratic attorneys general challenging the tariffs, which is good. And it was good when Republicans were challenging Biden's overreach as well. But you'll notice they're not really doing it on principle of separation of powers. They're doing it because they're the opposite party of the president. It's not something you can rely on, right? They're doing it for political purposes, not constitutional ones. And so it was awesome to see these small libertarian law firms stand up for principle and just say, hey, government's breaking the law. They're not following the Constitution. Court needs to step in and tell them they need to do that. And on behalf of a couple of very obscure small businesses that were harmed by these things, but were willing to go out there, stick their neck out, and have their name on this lawsuit, which is a huge credit to them as businesses as well, that they're willing to go through the ordeal of challenging the president on something. Working together, they were actually able to go to federal court and get a win by pointing to the Constitution. That's how the system's supposed to work. The court made very clear, if you want to do tariffs, you can pass a law in Congress. Totally allowed, totally constitutional. Still a bad idea economically, I would say, but totally constitutional. Or you can follow the law and follow the procedures in other parts of trade law that allow the president to issue tariffs on his own. But it has to be limited. It has to be constrained because ultimately that power belongs to Congress. Another thing the Trump administration is looking to do is restricting foreign students at American universities. Now, this might not seem directly economics related, but it is. And I want to talk about some of those connections. But before I do that, just a word about American universities. You know, I'm a conservative. I write for a conservative publication. I'm not a fan of a lot of the ideological views present in a lot of our universities. It's not a secret. Faculty are overwhelmingly left-wing. A lot of curriculum is, quite frankly, a lot of it's just not very good, but a lot of it is ideologically tinged as well in ways that it shouldn't be. The wealthiest private universities have enormous amounts of money of their own, and yet for some reason keep coming back to taxpayers for more. Taxpayer funding of universities is really a regressive form of welfare because the primary beneficiaries, at least from the consumer side of the equation, is upper middle class people who tend to be college students, people who never go to college, which are most people, especially most people who are below average in income in the United States. They do not see any of the benefits of this, yet they still get taxed for it. So I got a lot of problems with the universities. However, on a global scale, American universities kick butt. I mean, it's not a coincidence that so many people, the richest people from the most powerful families in other countries, send their kids to American universities. And not even just to the Ivy League schools. They send them to state schools. Because those schools are actually better than the best universities in most countries around the world, including other like rich developed countries. You're better off going to a school that we think of in the United States as like a middle tier state school. You're better off going to one of those than you are going to the best university in, I don't know, in Spain or in Portugal or in Belgium, let alone in South Africa or Kenya or Malaysia, or any other places further down the income ladder. And that's something we should be proud of as Americans, like that we attract all these great students from other places. Because again, it's a form of voting with your feet. These students could go to places in their own countries, but they choose to come here. Why? Because it's better. They're proving it. Very few Americans, Americans, we do study abroad. American students do study abroad for, a semester or something. But they don't go to those places to get degrees, by and large. Some people do, but it's not very common. It's much more common to go the other way. We should pay attention to that revealed preference that people have and put something behind it. Like, hey, maybe our universities are actually doing something right. I just heard Professor Barry Strauss of Cornell talk about this. And he said our universities are a national treasure. They're a tarnished treasure, but they are a treasure. That's how we need to treat them. Anyway, one of the arguments that the Trump administration is making is like that this is unfair that these foreign students take spots that could be occupied by Americans and they pay full price. And so universities are basically subsidizing education at their institutions by charging foreigners full price and becoming reliant on foreigners paying full price in order to fill up their coffers and allow them to provide the education that they provide, and that this is unfair to American students. Now, this is really a doozy coming from the Trump administration because in every other context, the Trump administration is angry that foreigners aren't buying more of our products. The whole problem with the trade war and all this stuff is supposed to be that foreigners need to buy more American stuff. because they don't buy enough American stuff right now, and Americans buy too much stuff from other places. But for some reason, when it comes to universities, something where, if you want to think about it this way, we have a trade surplus. The United States is a net exporter of university education. It's supposed to be a good thing, according to the protectionists. And foreigners are willing to pay more than Americans do for the exact same product. That's fantastic. If you're a protectionist, that's amazing. That's exactly what we want. They want that for everything. Yet for some reason, the one area where it does happen, they want to stop it. That's why this whole thing really isn't that serious. On an intellectual level. Serious, politically. But on an intellectual level, what are we talking about? And I think there's really something to this, because you can make a trade deficit or a trade surplus sound bad if you want to. We've all heard about how trade deficits sound bad. It seems unfair that Americans buy more from other places than the other places buy from Americans. We've all heard that. But you can make a trade surplus sound unfair too if you want to. That's exactly what they're doing with this foreign student issue. Because if foreigners are buying more stuff from Americans than Americans buy from foreigners, that means they're buying stuff that Americans could have bought otherwise. They're taking that stuff from Americans. The logic being, there's only so many student spots. The chunk that's filled by foreign students could be filled by American students just as easily. So, if you reduce the trade surplus by eliminating the foreign students, now you've given more to Americans. Isn't that more fair? I don't know, sure, maybe. It just doesn't really seem to be either here nor there. And this is the whole issue with why trade deficits, the balance of trade, the whole idea of balance of trade just doesn't matter. Because no matter what it is, you can always make it sound unfair if you want to. Because it's not actually a statement of something being good or bad. The balance of trade is an accounting statistic. It's just a product of the way that we keep track of imports and exports. That's all it is. So the whole idea of the balance of trade is a bad idea that will never die. Another bad idea that will never die seems to be rent control. One of the candidates for mayor of New York City, who is a self-described socialist, it's not some crazy free market guy calling him a socialist to be mean. He is a socialist. He has said there's going to be a rent freeze if he wins the election. His name is Zohran Mamdani. And he's got an advertisement out that says we're going to freeze the rent. And a bunch of people in apartments that are happy about this. Oh, good. We'll freeze the rent. Okay. I mean, first of all, if it was this easy, if you could just pass a law that says make stuff cheaper, why just freeze the rent? Why not cut it? Why not make it zero? Just give it away for free. And if you answer that question, well, that would be ridiculous. I mean, there'd be no way for people to make money. They'd screw up all the incentives. Well, freezing the rent is just a milder form of that. It's not anything really different in kind. It's only different in degree. So basically you're saying, I don't want all of the bad things that would come with setting the rent at zero by fiat. I only want some of them. And that's where this whole thing falls apart. It's really sad that this quote from the Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck remains relevant, but it still is. He said, in many cases, rent control appears to be the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city, except for bombing. And the reason for that is simple. If you can't price rentals for what they're actually worth, there's very little incentive for landowners to maintain them. Because no matter what condition it's in, they can't charge any more for it. So you might as well just leave it, cut those expenses of maintaining a property, because you'll get the same price whether you put the effort in to maintain it or not. Incentives matter. We know how this works out. We've seen it in countless cities around the world. This is one of the most empirically studied economic policies out there, over and over and over again. Cities, states, countries try rent control. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I think most people in their gut understand that you can't just write words on a page and make stuff cheaper. That is not how real life works. Assar Lindbeck, the Swedish economist who said that, he was writing from personal experience. Sweden did rent control. Very strict rent control. When they had a social democratic government for decades in the middle of the 20th century. It was terrible. Lindbeck is it's kind of funny because this quote is like the only thing he's known for outside of Sweden. But inside Sweden, he's actually a very well-regarded economist. He's no longer alive, I don't believe, but he was a very well-regarded economist inside Sweden, and he's not some ultra free market guy. He very much comes from a Swedish social democratic background, but he understood that markets matter and that markets worked. I actually read his book that this quote came from, and it's an extended critique of what was in the 1970s known as New Left economics, but really is progressive or socialist economics. And he is not some kind of bomb thrower free market guy. But he's just writing from experience. He's like, look, we tried this in Sweden. It didn't work. Don't do it again. Because he understands markets. Another guy who understands markets is Javier Milei, president of Argentina. And they got rid of the rent controls in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. They had super strict rent control. They got rid of it. And guess what? More properties appeared on the market. Rental supplies in Buenos Aires increased by over 170% after the rent controls were repealed. Now, why did that happen? How could that possibly happen? There's no way they built that many apartments in a couple of months. No, that wasn't it at all. Landlords who owned apartments who previously weren't renting them out started to rent them out again because they knew they could actually get the value that they needed for it to be profitable. Adjusted for inflation, the price of rent went down by 40%. So let me get this straight. They took away a price control preventing price increases. And by allowing price increases, the price went down? Yes. There's an old adage about this in economics. It's that the cure for high prices is high prices. The reason for that is if prices are high, more people will be attracted to sell in that market because the profit opportunity is higher. But as more people come into the market, there's more competition. Competition, competing for customers, means that you want to offer a lower price. So you come in and you undercut the other sellers. That process pulls the price down until you get to an equilibrium point where demand for apartments meets the supply of apartments. So that's exactly what happened in Buenos Aires when Argentina got rid of rent control. So we know it from the bad examples of rent control, We know from the good examples of getting rid of rent control is just not a good idea. We don't have to try this again in New York City. But who knows? They probably will. Well, now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. Paper of the episode is from the American Economic Review in May of 1990 by Robert Lucas of the University of Chicago. It's called Why Doesn't Capital Flow from Rich to Poor Countries? Now, this is an interesting question because if all you had was standard economic theory, it would make a lot of sense for capital to go from rich countries to poor countries. That's because rich countries already have a lot of capital. So the return of even more capital is not that big. But poor countries that don't have capital, and by capital here we mean technology, equipment, the stuff you use to make other stuff, factories, computers, stuff like that. Poor countries don't have a lot of that stuff. That's why they're poor. So giving them some of it would have really big returns. This is just a classic case of diminishing marginal returns. In countries that are already rich, you're way down into diminishing returns. So the extra unit of capital isn't going to give you that much. But in poor countries, you're only just starting on that curve. And so it makes a lot more sense to invest there. So if that was all that mattered, we would expect huge amounts of capital to flow from rich countries to poor countries, and the poor countries to come and catch up very quickly. But that is not what happens. And so Robert Lucas wrote this paper saying, well, what's going on? And he made the point that, well, that's clearly not all that matters. Some things that matter include human capital, which is, are the workers actually able to use the physical capital productively? Do they have enough education? Do they have the ability to be trained on some of these things? So that's part of it. But it's also big political risks in a lot of third world countries. A lot of these places are dictatorships, and they don't have very secure property rights. And so there's constant threat that the government can take your property. There's constant threats from other non-government actors in the society that they might take your property because the government's not powerful enough to enforce property rights. There's often very little chance that if your property does get taken, you'll get it back because the court system's not very good and it's hard to get a fair trial. And a lot of third world countries are simply not open to foreign investment. For many of the same mistaken protectionist reasons that are very popular right now in the United States. And so what Lucas says is, well, if we want poor countries to get richer, which we should, we need them to get more capital. But if we just give them capital, you're probably not going to help them very much because that's going to reduce private investment in capital. And it's going to make it harder for those countries to get ahead. And so what Lucas says is, well, if rich countries are going to provide poor countries with capital, the poor countries need to agree to be open to foreign investment. To allow those capital flows to happen, they need to agree to have better institutions and protect private property. So the paper is called Why Doesn't Capital Flow from Rich to Poor Countries by Lucas. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.